key customer for pharma has always been the patient. Eventually, though pharma is at an arm's length. So I think part of the challenge here for the industry has been the patient health outcome is the central problem. But I think as a result of privacy restrictions and the fact that the providers and the payers are a very integral part of taking care of the patient, and pharma is a couple of steps away, so to speak, it becomes a challenging for pharma to apply AI in the world of the patient. But how might that happen? So again, we've collected a few examples, probably 8 or 10 of the more popular use cases. The intent here is not to be exhaustive, of course, but just to see some sort of broad patterns, right? Without going into too much detail on the individual bullets. First, if you lay out the journey of the patient, it's very useful to think about, if I'm going to create a medicine in a therapy area that I'm entering as a pharma company, where can I add value? Of course, we create the medicine. But after inventing the medicine, you still have to solve a lot of problems because the patient has to get diagnosed, they have to originate, they have to get the right diagnosis, the right treatment, and then they have to stay on therapy, which is a huge challenge. So just to give you a sense of what the business challenges are here, if I'm a rare disease company, and there are 7,000 rare diseases, finding the right patient to get on my disease, to get the right diagnosis, to even know that this medicine actually is the appropriate one for them is a challenge. It takes 7 years and 8 misdiagnoses before you get the right diagnosis as a patient. So think about the sort of broader healthcare problem, right? Can AI help figure out who these likely patients are likely to be? Where might they be? What kind of characteristics might they have? Because that will help the patient get a faster diagnosis. It'll help the physicians who don't have to go through all these iterations. And of course, it will help eventually the life science company as well. So that becomes a key problem in the diagnosis, treatment selection sort of part of the spectrum here, the second and third column. I'm just giving you a few examples. A second example that you begin to see is on the other side. So after the prescription is written, it's perfect, everything is good. The patient has the prescription, but of course, 30% of the time, 30 to 50% of the time, they basically do not complete the course of therapy. Partly it's an access issue, partly it's not been fulfilled, partly they fall off compliance after 2 or 3 months. And it's a huge, huge loss to the healthcare system, and of course, detriment of the patient as well. So it's a broader healthcare problem. And one of the challenges, because it is about the pharmaceutical drug, is pharma is now increasingly and enthusiastically applying AI to the problem of, can I predict when the patient falls off therapy? And why is that? Because falling off after 45 days and falling off after 6 months are totally different phenomena. So I have to get down into the detail and look at the drivers. And there could be 50 drivers that may be possible. Which ones work at what step for what kind of patient? That's a detailed problem. Humans were not very good at it. That's why it was a $300 billion unsolved problem for the industry adherence. But now we're beginning to make inroads because we can predict the patient, we can predict the reasons, and more importantly, AI is giving us the insight to say, if that's the prediction and this is the reason, what can I do about it? So that's the other lesson, I think, that the AI approaches can't just stop at insight or prediction. They have to carry forward all the way to action, because that intervention is really at the micro level, whether it be physician or patient, makes a big difference. And so that is, I think, one of the maturation of AI in healthcare, in life sciences, about really getting to driving the action and not just stopping at the prediction. And you can see the impact here. Couple of things you'll see in terms of AI applications in this domain. They tend to cluster around the treatment decision, but not on it. And as you can imagine, that has still been a struggle, which is to come up with an algorithm that says this is the right treatment or the right medication for the patient is not something it shouldn't. It needs the full cooperation and partnership of providers, payers, and other data. And in fact, when we did some independent research, which I won't talk about today, about physician attitudes, about AI being kind of a colleague or an advisor, I think we are a long ways away from that. And so the search is really about what is it that AI can do that is a good recommendation or a suggestion, so that AI and the human, the doctor in this case, can actually come together on the right recommendation. So it is not a replacement, it is an enhancement. And those are the areas where the adoption has worked. And a case in point, just to give you an example again, in the patient domain. And this is actually a real world data domain, which actually helps with both the clinical trials part and the post launch part. This was in NASH, liver disease, basically. And the idea here was that how do you identify NASH patients? NASH is quite prevalent and very underdiagnosed. Of course, you can confirm it with a liver biopsy, but you don't want to get to that point, both for the expense and the inconvenience for every single patient where you might suspect it. So what you need is an intelligent screener which can make that prediction happen. And so, as you can imagine, this is a very, very deep domain related model. So it's not as easy as just putting a bunch of data together. We had to do a lot of literature review and medical interviews to even understand what the right risk factors are. Of course, most healthcare organizations have that resource. But then the question becomes, how do you put together the different data sources to come up with something like 200 to 300 features, and picking the right features that then go into a model, which I won't talk a lot about. I think the audience here would understand that sort of the stalwart modeling approaches, right? XGBoost, neural networks. We had to try 3 or 4 things. That's another lesson. You have to try 4 things before something really works well. And so there is a high probability of failure, at least initially, with a lot of these ideas. But eventually we got to a point where, 80% accuracy was achieved. And the reason I want to bring out this example is a couple of things. One is that it emphasized the importance of using real world data, which is quite incomplete. The incompleteness is very strong. So just to give you a sense, in oncology, data completeness is 15 to 20% when it comes to claims data. 15 to 20%. On the other hand, that's more than enough for AI to start making reasonable extrapolations. So data is woefully incomplete. It has to be patched together across different data sources, hence the problem of variety I talked about. And that degrades the data even more and more. But I think the mindset here is, if the data is stupider, the algorithm has to be smarter, right? So the AI is compensating for that in many ways, rather than trying to become very perfect with good data. And the way that this is used, of course, it was used for increasing the speed of trial enrollment, because rather than putting everybody who could potentially go in the trial through a liver biopsy, which is a very, very high patient burden, you could actually come up with the screening to augment an existing process, augment an existing human decision. And of course, on the flip side, it also helps to create the right awareness and screening for patients when the drug is approved, because you can go through something that is simply about information collection and not about an invasive procedure. You do that only when you're pretty confident the procedure is going to be positive. And because this is a highly regulated industry, it is important for AI to come up with, where are the elements where I can interlock with a human decision and stay within the protocols of regulation. Now, regulation is changing. The FDA is evolving, but as we all know, that's a relatively slow process. And so we have to make sure that we can enhance human decision making within the context of that constraint. The world of the product has actually very similar issues. In the interest of time, I won't spend a ton of time on this, because I did want to emphasize, as you've seen, maybe disproportionately, that even though most of the industry is spending its AI investments in this area, in the world of the product, with discovery, with R&D, which is all good because it's an important problem to solve, I think they have under-indexed a little bit on some of the short-term horizon impact that Omer and I talked about earlier with the physician and the patient. So in the commercial world, is it possible to get and see impact with some of the decisions we talked about within a 2-year window, a 2 to 3 year window? Because many of the things that we want to change on the clinical trial and the drug discovery side are either some things that have to fit within, of course, the regulation, but also fit within a very long time horizon. Remember the 8.5 years it takes to go from inception to potential approval. And so that's a longer horizon. And so when you think about a portfolio of cases, you have to kind of make bets in both areas, as opposed to mostly bets in one side of the basket, if you will. What are some of the problems that we see here? So the big problem is the clinical trial, right? So drug discovery is an important issue. In fact, 1/3 of all AI investment in healthcare is going into drug discovery. But a lot of that is actually happening outside the walls of the big pharma company, with startups, with companies like Benevolent AI, with In Sitro, In Silico, and there's hundreds of them. They're doing a lot of the innovation which pharma is importing, which is great. But within the walls, again, the sort of focus of this particular discussion is actually the clinical trial design area, where, like I said before, 37% of clinical trial sites don't recruit all the patients they're supposed to. 11% of them don't recruit a single patient, zero. The question is, why were they planned that way? Can we use AI to predict, if I planned a trial a particular way, how many people would I recruit? Would they complete the trial? What's happening with this ongoing site? Can I intervene sooner? So think of it as a huge problem in complex logistics to improve the efficiency of the decision making so that I can reduce both the cost and the time. And if I can save 20% of the cost of the $2.6 billion, that is extremely, extremely substantial. And so we see a number of areas emerging here around clinical trial design and planning and optimization, which of course are built on the AI prediction of, if I make this particular trial happen, how will it pan out? Both in terms of the design, the inclusion exclusion criteria, but also finding the right patient cohorts, but then of course going city by city, country by country, globally, where should I put these sites? And then of course, how can I intervene once the trial gets going? With virtual trials, which is one of the results of COVID, this area has sort of kicked into high gear because obviously patients drop out, and they've dropped out even more. And as trials are resuming, this sort of 1 in 3 loss that we see, patients who have been recruited basically don't complete the trial. That's another area where you want to be able to predict and intervene. It's very much like the compliance issue, patients dropping off, but in this case, the trial. So you can begin to see some of the parallels, that if you can actually hone the approaches, the methods, some of the data, some of the behavioral aspect of what a human does as opposed to the clinical aspect, can you actually use your leverage your learnings from the R&D side to commercial, or vice versa, so that you can actually bring these two pieces a little bit closer together. They do tend to operate in silos in a pharma company, at least as far as AI.